All right, continuing on with my series reading from some passages. I'm going to start from this book, Logos Rising, History of Ultimate Reality. It's by E. Michael Jones. I haven't read anything from this author. I've watched a few of his videos. I understand there's some controversy surrounding him, which makes me all the more interested in reading from him. So I'm just going to start from the introduction. This is a large book. It seems to be sophisticated in terms of philosophy, and it's got the sections, right? So the introduction is what I'm going to read from today is entitled, I don't know if I have time here. Yeah, it's entitled Bertrand Russell and the Ultimate Reality. So part one of the book, I'll go through the table of contents. Part one is entitled The History of Logos. Chapter 1, The Beginning of Everything. Chapter 2, The Beginning of Man. The beginning of civilization, the beginning of philosophy, the beginning of Christianity. Subsections in that chapter, Paul and the philosophers, John and the Logos, Augustine and the discovery of time. Chapter 6 is the beginning of Islam. Chapter 7, the beginning of science. Part 2 is entitled The Logos of History. Chapter 8 is Vico and the rediscovery of history, Hegel and the science of history, Klutgen and the retreat from history, Nietzsche's anti-logos and Scheben's trinity, Heisenberg and the collapse of atomism, Martin brings logos to the new world, and Ennis Mirabilis, 1979. Those are the sections. So I'm going to start here with the introduction, Bertrand Russell and Ultimate Reality. Probably read through a few pages here. It's probably 30 some pages in the introduction. So, quote, to start the introduction, Bertrand Russell and the Ultimate Reality, quote, most philosophers rightly or wrongly believe that philosophy can give us knowledge, not otherwise attainable, concerning the universe as a whole and concerning the nature of ultimate reality. It's a quote from Bertrand Russell. So starting in on the introduction. At the beginning of 2015, I spent 6 weeks traveling through India. The Catholics are a tiny minority in a sea of over 1 billion people, most of whom are Hindu. But they have a significant cultural asset. They have established a network of schools which are the best in India. Because they are the best, 80% of the students attending these schools are Hindus. I met one of those students at a Catholic school I visited in Delhi. After I gave a short talk to an English class of 16-year-olds, a Hindu teenager by the name of Samil stood up and asked if I could come up with the scientific proof of the existence of God. He asked this question because he lived in a culture which had lost its religion, which had lots of religion and lots of science, but no coherent explanation of how the one related to the other. I discovered this during a trip to Mumbai, where my guide, Father Cyril Fernandez, who had founded 4 Catholic schools himself, took me to the city's temple in Ganesha. Father Cyril assures me that it's famous, and if the crowd is in any indication, what he said must be true. To get in, you have to take your shoes off and get in line with the worshipers. Before we got to the big attraction, we have to pass through 2 big silver mice. The Hindus approach them with garlands, which they put around the neck of one of the mice. Then a man places what looks like a saddle blanket or dholi over the mouse's back, bends down and whispers his prayers, which is to say his requests into the mouse's ear. The mouse is then supposed to scamper off and tell God what he had just heard. So instead of from your mouth to God's ear, it's from your mouth to the mouse's ear to God's ear. His wife and children then do the same. The main show was a bit disappointing after that. The idol of Ganesha, the chubby fellow with the elephant's head, was gold with a silver background, but disappointingly small, especially after I saw the 3-story tall monkey god Hanuman in Delhi. The Hindu priest was bare-chested, but wearing a saffron skirt. After taking the pilgrims' offerings, he gave half of them back as a sort of quid pro quo. After visiting Ganesha's temple, we went directly to the Nehru Science Center, something like the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago or the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. As we stood in line to get in, I contemplated a mural just aside from the front door entitled Cosmic Evolution, which attempted to portray the history of the cosmos from the Big Bang to the present. The passive voice abounded. At the beginning of absolutely everything, we are told, atoms formed. The extensive use of the passive voice in the mural was dead giveaway for the fact that cosmic evolution was another word for an attack on causality. To say that atoms formed was the scientific equivalent to saying shit happens. The shit in question, according to the Nehru Science Center's cosmology, had uncanny similarities to the traditional Hindu cosmology, symbolized by the image of the earth resting on the back of an elephant and an elephant standing on a turtle. From that point on, it's turtles all the way down for both Nehru and Ganesh. The juxtaposition of the Hindu temple and the Nehru Science Center on the Mumbai bus tour was instructive. The fact that India has gone from worshipping elephants, monkeys, and cobras to worshipping science with no metaphysical experience in between reminded me that G.B. Shaw described America as a, quote, country that went from barbarism to decadence without finding civilization along the way, end quote. So India seems destined to become a country of cobra-worshipping computer programmers. The Catholics could make a significant contribution through their educational system, but they seem disinclined to push the issue, perhaps because of India's penchant for syncretism, perhaps because of the rise of Hindu nationalism and the forced conversions they are orchestrating among India's Christians, or perhaps out of fear of losing their schools. During my trip, I had a long philosophical discussion with another Catholic priest about Hindu philosophy. He says the Hindu concept of Maya, the world as a veil and illusion, is similar to Plato's idea of the world becoming, which is incomprehensible, as opposed to the forms or the world of being, which is transcendent. Similarly, the Hindu concept of neti, not this, not that, is not unlike the via negativa of the mystics. I'm sure there are similarities, but in spite of them, India has the land of 33 million gods where Logos died a long time ago. So I was not surprised when Samil asked me to prove the existence of God, which I did in the following way. Nothing comes from nothing. There is something, therefore there was never nothing. This something could not bring itself into existence because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed, which is impossible. Therefore, something else had to bring it into existence. That something is what Aristotle called the uncaused caused, or the unmoved mover. Aquinas ends his proofs for the existence of God by saying that this being all men call God. There was a moment of stunned silence, or incomprehension, and then Samil asked me if time travel were possible, and I said, of course, I've come from the future. The sexual revolution that America experienced in the 60s is happening in India now. More stunned silence. One of the best-known expositors of the dichotomy between religion and science in the English-speaking world was Bertrand Russell. Russell believed in an ultimate reality, and he believed that he could know it and convey it in his readers because he was a philosopher, and most philosophers, rightly or wrongly, believe that philosophy can give us knowledge not otherwise attainable concerning the universe as a whole and concerning the nature of ultimate reality. Russell's publisher felt the same way. On the frontispiece to An Outline of Philosophy, we read, quote, throughout the book, Russell attempts to reveal the sort of world in which, according to modern science, we really live and just how it differs from the world in which we seem to live. He makes clear the effect of modern scientific advance, which has transformed our concept of the world. In this book, the new world is presented with great clarity, end quote. As the passage makes clear, understanding science, not philosophy, is essential if we want to hope to get access to any ultimate reality. Russell's American publisher, again, makes this clearer than Russell himself when he writes that it was his conviction that Mr. Russell is the one scholar today who would undertake a revision of philosophy in terms of modern science. Russell had corresponded earlier with the American behaviorist John B. Watson because he, like Watson, was hoping to analyze mental phenomenon using only physical events as data because it fit nicely with the direction of Russell's own thinking on the nature of mind, which was materialistic in the philosophical sense of the term. Russell tries to appear even-handed in his discussion of the history of philosophy, telling us that Berkeley felt that ultimate reality was, quote, an idea of the mind of God, end quote. But the musings of such bishops in the 18th century has superseded by sober science, which tells us that, quote unquote, ultimate reality is a vast collection of electric charges in violent motion. Russell called his philosophy logical atomism, an idea that he got from Lucretius, who also gave him his understanding of religion as, quote, a disease born of fear and a source of untold misery to the human race, end quote. Lucrates, like Democritus, his Greek predecessor, believed that ultimate reality could be reduced to atoms and the void. Russell begins his discussion of philosophy by taking a page from Descartes. Things are not what they seem. Instead of talking about wax, Russell talks about a table. Quote, naive common sense supposes that things are what they appear to be, but that is impossible since they do not appear exactly alike to any two simultaneous observers. If we are going to admit that the object is not what we see, we can no longer feel the same assurance that there is an object. This is the first intrusion of doubt. However, we shall speedily recover from this setback and say that, of course, the object is really what physicists say it is. Now, physics says that a table or a chair is really an incredible vast system of electrons and protons in rapid motion with empty space in between, end quote. According to his understanding of logical atomism, Russell believed that physics held the key to understanding ultimate reality, but he did so when belief in atomism was becoming increasingly illogical. Under the scrutiny of German physicists like Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger, quote, the last vestiges of the old solid atom had melted away and matter has become as ghostly as anything in a spiritual seance, end quote. Russell, as a result, finds himself in a bind. He is a logical atomist, living when the old conception of matter as an indestructible substance has been replaced by, quote, emanations from a locality, the sort of influences that characterize haunted rooms and ghost stories. All sorts of events happen in the physical world, but tables and chairs, the sun and moon, and even our daily bread have become pale abstractions, mere laws exhibited in the succession of events which radiate from certain regions. You would think that a logical atomist would find this sort of revelation devastating, but Russell seemed remarkably unmoved by scientific discovery, which is tantamount to announcing that he is no longer in contact with ultimate reality because truth, if by that we mean the correspondence of mind and thing or reality, has never Russell's main concern, since philosophical knowledge, quote, philosophical knowledge does not differ essentially from scientific knowledge, end quote. Heisenberg has created, quote, an open world of free possibilities, end quote. Russell was always more interested in freedom, which he had defined as the ability to act without regard for the moral law. When it comes to the ultimate reality, Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy is even more useful than Laplace's determinism. Given his materialism, it comes to no surprise that Russell finds ethics repugnant. Russell deals with ethics in the outline of philosophy only because it is, quoted, is traditionally a department of philosophy, end quote. Left to his own devices, he would have omitted it, quote, but to prove this would take as long as to discuss the subject itself and would be less interesting, end quote. Without any indication that he is changing horses in midstream, Russell uses the terms ethics and morals interchangeably so that he can shift the argument away from philosophy and talk about revelation. Russell was familiar with the categorical imperative, which was Kant's attempt to formulate an ultimate ethical principle on the basis of reason alone, but he chose not to discuss it even though he mentions Kant often, even if only to dismiss him as overrated. By ignoring ethics, which is to say the examination of practical reason on philosophical terms, Russell can then dismiss it as coming from revelation, which is to say religion, which means that he automatically wins the argument because, as all intelligent people know, religion is no longer in contact with ultimate reality. More importantly, quote, the philosopher cannot but observe that there has been many revelations and that it is not clear why he should not adopt the one rather than the other. At this point, Russell focuses on conscience, which he again describes in religious rather than philosophical terms as, quote, a personal revelation to each individual, which, quote, invariably tells him what is right or wrong, end quote. He then dismisses conscience as something that is unreliable because it varies from age to age. And then as an example of that unreliability, he mentions the Inquisition, although not by name, as a time when people were burnt at the stake for making mistakes in metaphysics. Quote, most people nowadays consider it wrong to burn a man alive for his disagreeing with them in metaphysics. But formerly, this was held to be a highly meritorious act, provided it was done in the interest of the right metaphysics. No one who has studied the history of moral ideas can regard conscience as invariably right. Thus, we are driven to abandon the attempt to define virtue by means of a set of rules of conduct, end quote. The good, according to Russell, is, quote, an act toward which I feel the emotion of approval, end quote. Emotions, needless to say, do not partake in the ultimate reality. They are personal, idiosyncratic, and ultimately based on irrational cultural circumstances that change over time and according to the vagaries of geography. We know that, quote, the rules of morals differ according to the age, the race, and the creed of community concerned, because science, in particular the science of anthropology, has told us so. This means, of course, that the rules of ethics need to be corrected periodically in light of the ultimate reality with which science confers on everything. That means that, quote, the received moral code, insofar as it is taught in education and embodied in public opinion or the criminal law, should be carefully examined in each generation to see whether it still serves to achieve desirable ends, and if not, in what respects it needs to be amended. The moral code, in short, like the legal code, should adapt itself to changing circumstances, keeping the public good always as its motive, end quote. Lord Russell never gets around to telling us who should determine where the moral code needs amending, but it is clear that he, as a philosopher in tune with the ultimate reality, as well as a pampered member of the upper classes in England, as well as the habitué of the Bohemian demi-monde known as Bloomsbury, was the best man for the job, and for most of the 20th century, he did just that, even if philosophy had to take a back seat to science to accomplish this. Knowledge, as Bacon told us, is power. This meant that those who possessed science possessed power. Truth was, therefore, the opinion of the powerful. That meant concretely that, quote, the question of the goodness or badness of the world is one for science rather than philosophy, end quote. That meant that, quote, the world is good if it has certain characteristics that we desire, end quote. Russell claimed, without specifying who constituted the we in question, it wasn't philosophers because, quote, philosophy professed to be able to prove that the world had such characteristics, but it is now fairly evident that the proofs were invalid, end quote. It wasn't scientists either. It was philosophers of science like, well, Bertrand Russell. Materialist philosophy had fallen on hard times because Heisenberg and Schrödinger had all undermined the materiality of matter, which Russell erroneously associates with substance. Quote, the notion of substance in the sense of the permanent entity with changing states is no longer applicable to the world. It may happen, as with the electron, that a string of events are so interconnected causally that it is particularly convenient to regard them as forming one entity. But where this happens it is a scientific fact, not a metaphysical necessity. The whole question of personal immortality, therefore, lies outside philosophy and is to be decided, if at all, either by science or by revealed religion, end quote. But once again, who gets to determine the difference between scientific fact and metaphysical necessity, if not Bertrand Russell? On March 6, 1927, Russell gave a talk at the Battersea Town Hall under the auspices of the South London branch of National Secular Society on the topic, quote, Why I Am Not a Christian, which had uncanny similarities to my encounter with Samil in Delhi. Russell got right to the heart of the matter in his talk by disputing what he calls, quote, the first cause argument, end quote, for the existence of God, which was a crude variation of one of Aquinas' cosmological proofs and not unlike the argument I made to Samil. Needless to say, Russell was unimpressed. After his dismissive replication of the argument, he writes, quote, you can see that the argument that there must be a first cause is one that cannot have any validity. I may say that when I was a young man and I was debating these questions very seriously in my mind, I for a long time accepted the argument of first cause, until one day, at the age of 18, I read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence, quote, my father taught me that the question, who made me, cannot be answered, since it immediately suggests the further question, who made God, end quote. That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of first cause. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, so that there cannot be any validity in the argument, end quote. The answer to Russell's quandary lay not in the fallacy in the argument of the first cause, but in the ignorance of metaphysics. In a debate with Russell on the BBC in 1948, Frederick Copleston explained the difference between necessary and contingent being as necessary to understanding why creation, or what Russell calls the world, is not a candidate for the first cause, but why God, or what Copleston calls necessary being, is. To those interested in Russell's befuddlement when it comes to genuine philosophical discussion, I recommend listening to the entire debate. The crux of the discussion revolves around the distinction between contingent and necessary being. A contingent thing, according to Copleston, is something which does not contain within itself the reason for its existence. If we mention why a contingent thing exists, we must mention why some other thing upon which its existence depends. We must call upon some necessary thing if we are to explain the existence of contingent things. If the existence of contingent things needs an explanation, we must conclude that there is such a thing as God. Copleston explained with his position in the following terms, quote, "We know that there are some beings in the world which do not contain in themselves the reason for their existence. For example, I depend on the existence of my parents. I depend on the existence of my parents, and now on the existence of the air and food, and so on. The world is simply the real or imagined totality of individual objects, none of which contain in themselves alone the reason for their existence. There isn't any world distinct from the objects that form it any more than there is a human race apart from its members. Therefore, since objects exist and since no object of experience contains within itself the reason for its existence, this reason and the totality of objects must have a reason for its existence external to itself. That reason must be an existing being. This being is either itself the reason for its own existence, or it is not. If it is, well and good. If it is not, then we must proceed further. But if we proceed to infinity, then there is no explanation for the existence for existence at all. So in order to explain existence, we must come to a being which contains within itself the reason for its own existence. That is to say, which cannot not exist." End quote. The being which cannot not exist is what all men call God. Russell counters Copleston's proof by claiming that, quote, "a necessary proposition has got to be analytic. Proposition such as this is an animal can never be analytic." End quote. But that is beside the point, because Copleston's proposition is based on the assertion of empirical fact. Quote, "If there's a contingent being actually existing, it has to be discovered by experience. The proposition that there is such a thing as a contingent being is certainly not an analytic proposition. But once you know that there is such a thing as a contingent being, it follows necessity that there must be a necessary being." End quote. The proposition, quote, "if there is a contingent being, then there is a necessary being," end quote, is according to Copleston a, quote, "a necessary proposition," end quote, or what Russell referred to as an analytic proposition. Copleston based his argument on Aristotle's arguments against an infinite regress. In his essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, Russell claimed that the cosmological argument for the uncaused cause or unmoved mover, quote, "is exactly of the same nature as the Hindus' view that the world rested upon an elephant and the elephant rested upon a tortoise," end quote, when in fact it is the exact opposite argument, because when he asked for the answer to the question, "How about the tortoise?" the Indian did not say, as Russell claimed, quote, "suppose we change the subject," end quote, but rather, quote, "it's turtles all the way down," end quote, which was the in-choate Indian way of referring to what Aristotle referred to as the infinite regress. Russell could have saved himself considerable embarrassment as a philosopher if he had understood Aristotle's Metaphysics, in which Aristotle explains why an infinite regress is impossible, or in terms of the Hindu cosmology, why turtles all the way down is not a coherent explanation of anything. Quote, for in the infinite series here described, and in infinities in generally, all the parts down to the one before us are similarly middle terms, and hence, where there is no first term, there is no explanation at all." End quote. An infinite regress, turtles all the way down, is impossible because, quote, "the terms in the former being intermediate must have an end, and the terms of the latter change into another, inasmuch as the destruction of one is the genesis of the other," end quote. Russell goes on to say, quote, There's no reason why the world could not have come into existence without a cause, nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There is no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps I need not waste any more time on the argument about the first cause, end quote. Aristotle refers to those who deny the principle of non-contradiction as suffering from a, quote, lack of education, end quote, because they should know that, quote, there cannot be a demonstration of everything altogether, because there would then be an infinite regress, and hence there would be still no final demonstration, end quote. An infinite regress is also destructive of the good because, quote, those who assume an infinite regress fail to notice that they remove the nature of the good. For no one would try to do anything if it was not going to arrive at a limit. Rationality, at least, is incompatible with such an infinite series, for the reasonable man always acts for the sake of something, and this serves as a limit for the end of his limit. For the end is the limit, end quote. Minds greater than Bertrand Russell's have debated whether man can know without the aid of revelation whether the world is eternal or whether it came into being. Revelation asserted the latter claim in the book of Genesis. But time is not the issue. The issue is causality. When Russell says, quote, the idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination, end quote, he is referring to time, not causality, inadvertently revealing his inability to distinguish between the two. Cosmic evolution has a beginning, of course. It is known as the Big Bang. But a beginning in time is no substitute for causality. Even if the world were eternal, by which he meant coextensive with time, Aquinas showed in De Aeternita Mundi Contra Mura Mortentis that it still had to come into existence. Aquinas went on to say that the cosmos would not bring itself into existence because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed, which is impossible. In making that clarification, Aquinas rescued philosophy from the dead and known as Averism, named after Idou Rishad, known as Averroes in the West, whose main disciple in Paris in the 13th century was Siger of Brabant. Siger violated the principle of non-contradiction by saying that both Aristotle and the Quran were right, even when they contradicted each other. So I think I'm going to stop right there. It's just maybe half of the introduction. That was maybe 3/4. So thanks for listening.